The sun was just starting to set, but the corrugated tin roof of the pavilion still brightly reflected the light that sneaked through the other buildings in the L tracks. The kitchen area was a mess, but I noticed that someone had taken a few of the tools that were scattered about and leaned them up against the shed. The hay bales were also arranged in what looked to be intended for seating, and as I got close enough to Melissa, she threw her body over the harvest bin and covered the top with her torso. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Nothing. Can you get me a knife?" "A knife. You're lying across the harvest bin, obviously hiding something, and you want me to get you a knife." "Yes." "You know I can't give you a knife. What do you have under there?" "Nothing. We need a cutting board, too." She had a playfulness to her tone, but after the previous scene, I wasn't in the mood. So I put my hand on her shoulder and pulled her up. She protested by shouting, "No, you can't look in there." Even though she probably didn't weigh much less than me, she was short enough that I was able to move her, revealing about a dozen peppers and tomatoes and a pile of lettuce leaves, all sitting on top of a layer of dirt that was never emptied from the bin. "What's all this?" "We were going to make you dinner, but you ruined it," Melissa shouted as she whined. I didn't respond to her tone. Instead, I asked, "Why are you guys making me dinner?" Armin had now joined us under the pavilion and explained with his standard level of sass, "Because your wife ain't here and you ain't got no one to cook for you." "What makes you think I need Elisa to cook for me?" "Oh, please," Armin threw his hand up. "You know you a man, you don't know how to cook." "Well, can't argue with that. If you guys want to cook for me, that would be great. What's on the menu?" "All this." Armin ran his hand across the top of the bin. "Okay, so what do we need to do first?" I asked. "We need to cut it up." Melissa shook her head as if the answer was obvious. "Before we do that, we probably need to wash it, so I'm going to go turn on the hose, and if you all can handle washing the veggies without spraying each other, then we can eat together." They all agreed, and I walked back to the house, first turning on the water, and then inside to get 2 dull knives and the cutting board. When I came back outside, Brian was back in the farm standing next to his sisters, as Melissa controlled the hose and sprayed the vegetables, and Armand held the bin. Brian avoided my eye contact as I came out, so I directly asked him, "Do you think you're going to be able to control yourself?" "Yes," he said as he kept his eyes focused on the ground. "Good, because your sisters are cooking me dinner." "I'm helping too. Give me that knife," Armin demanded. "Listen, I'm going to give you and Melissa the knife. You are the only two who are allowed to use it." "But," Missy started. "No buts. That's the way it is," I told Missy. "But I have a special job for you." She smiled, letting her tongue rest between the huge gap in her mouth where she was missing her entire front row of teeth. "You can rip up the lettuce and put it in the bowl." Instantly, her shoulders raised to her ears and her lips tightened again. "But I want to use the knife," she shouted. "Missy, shut up. Here, I'll help you," Brian offered. I was tempted to correct him for telling his sister to shut up, but he took her by the hand and brought her over to the table. He then picked up the freshly washed lettuce, shook it a few times, and brought it over. Elisa had known these kids since Brian was Missy's age, so she had a better insight than me. But I still never believed her when she would recount how Brian was actually the first one to come to the farm. Brian was the first one who learned how to sow seeds in a row, and it was Brian who actually could tell the difference between kale and collards when we asked him to go harvest. In a few minutes, all of the lettuce was ripped up, the peppers were chopped, and the tomatoes were diced. "All right, now let's put everything in the bowl, and I'll go get us some stuff to make a dressing. I'll take those knives, too," I added as I beat Brian's hand to one of the knives that was sitting on the table. He just smiled at me and laughed. I gave a quick nod, raised my eyebrow, and went back into the house. I threw the knives and the cutting board in the sink and filled a small mason jar with olive oil, balsamic vinegar, and some salt. When I came back out, Melissa asked me, "Where's the plates?" "Oh, yeah, hold on." I placed the dressing on the table and went back inside to grab the plates. It took me a moment as I had to consider which plates we could afford to have break if they fell on the ground. When I finally made my selections, I went back outside to see Missy and Brian, each with their hands on different parts of the jar, tugging it back and forth. "Give it to me," Missy strained as she pulled on the jar. "Stop it, Missy, you're going to spill it." "Both of you stop it. Put it down on the table," I commanded. I looked around and noticed that Jamie, Laura, and Max must have left the garden when I was in the house. "Ugh, I hate you," Missy shouted at Brian. "So what? You're ugly," he said, shaking his head in retort. "Listen, you all need to calm down." I had no idea how I was going to achieve this directive, so I went with the first line of reasoning that came into my head. "You guys are all Puerto Rican, right? You're part Puerto Rican." I asked Brian, Missy, and Melissa. They all nodded their heads. Their cousins Sean and Patrick didn't say anything. I turned to Armin and his cousins. "And you're all Puerto Rican." "We're Dominican," one of his cousins responded. So I was wrong on both of the accounts of their ethnic heritage and their linguistic capabilities, but I pressed on. "Well, I'm Italian, and we came from very similar cultures. And what's important in both of our cultures?" "Music," Brian answered. "Cats," Missy exclaimed. I didn't know how to respond to that, but before I could think of something, Armin answered. Food? Yes, food, I pointed at him. And what's even more important is how we eat food. Do we eat while we're running around the farm? No, they all said in unison. Exactly, we eat food while we're sitting at a table, just like this, I went on. It's important to sit around a table, be together while we eat dinner. And part of sitting around the table is making good conversation and having good manners. So, what are some good manners? Saying please and thank you, Sean answered. Yes, that's good. What else? Not calling people stupid, Brian offered. Yes, that's a good one, especially for you, I said, which he thankfully laughed at. Anything else? Armin looked like he was about to say something, but Melissa spoke first. When you're reaching over someone to get something, you're supposed to say, pardon my reach, while you do it. Yeah, I stuttered. I had no idea where that came from, but I let her know. That's a very good one. Thanks, Melissa. Okay, so can we eat now? Armin sighed. Can we eat now? I let the word now hang on my vocal cords for a second. Please, they all shouted. Yes, of course, I answered as we began handing out the plates. They all had a plate when I realized that I had forgotten to grab a serving spoon. I was just about to get up when everyone at the table just shoved their hands into the salad and served themselves. It was hard to ignore Armin's hand stained with dirt or the runny nose that Missy kept wiping with her wrist, but I did my best and made sure to go a little heavier on the dressing. I sat there trying to remember if balsamic vinegar had the same disinfecting qualities as white vinegar, but everyone else ate their meals, and no one even slightly raised a voice, nor did they use a fork.